All right, I see a hand going up, so at least one person can hear me. Fantastic. All right, well, I will go ahead and get started. So here is the agenda for today. I'm just going to give a really quick overview of the Climate Action Reserve and what we do. And then we're going to dive deep into the weeds of nitrogen management with Teresa Lang. Once we get through kind of the details of the protocol and some kind of examples of the project, we're going to open up for a Q&A and open up for the audio. So getting started, the reserve, a little background in history. We are a North American carbon offsets program. We're a little interesting in that we were started by the state in 2001 with the mission to encourage voluntary emission reductions and being able to credit those emission reductions and quantify those in a standardized way. We were previously known as the California Climate Action Registry. We've changed tack in 2008 following the passage of AB 32, California's Global Warming Solution Act. We moved away from kind of enterprise-wide voluntary reporting standards into project-level emission reductions and creating standardized methodologies for quantifying and crediting those emission reductions at the project level. So we still kind of work in this space of, between business and government and promoting environmental goals. And beginning as of last month, we are now accredited by the state of California to serve as an offset project registry serving California's cap-and-trade program. So just a little bit of our objectives. The way that we approach offsets is really trying to enhance offsets and showing that they can have true environmental integrity, that they can be a useful tool to combat climate change. And as far as our program, we try to make a registry that's very rigorous, very conservative, but also streamlined, allows for scaling up in volume, and is user-friendly. Kind of where we're at today is we're kind of linking both our voluntary program with emerging compliance markets and principally the California Cap-and-Trade program. So again, these are kind of the three components of what we do, and Teresa is really going to talk about kind of the development side of developing high-quality standards, and she'll get into the whole stakeholder process. We also manage independent third-party verification as well as operating a transparent registry system where you can go in and look at all of our approved projects as well as the credits that have been generated from those projects. So just moving ahead, here's a quick glance at our protocols that we currently have adopted, the top four being those that can be used for compliance in California. And moving along into our agricultural protocols, I think Teresa's going to jump in and tell us a little bit more about these.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Scott. So at this point, the Reserve has adopted three, well, I guess technically there's four because we have two livestock protocols for the agricultural sector. Just wanted to give you a brief overview of kind of what we've done in the past couple of years with that regard. Today we're talking about the Nitrogen Management Project Protocol, which is specifically targeting nitrous oxide emission reductions resulting from a change in nitrogen management, and I'll talk more specifically about what that means in a moment. We adopted version 1.0 of the protocol on June 27th, 2012, and version 1.1, we've been working on it for a while. I know some of you are probably anxiously awaiting to see the final result of that update. That will be released by COB today. I had hoped to have it out as of last night so you could all take a look at it if you're very eager before this webinar, but I promise that will be out today. I actually have a printed copy in front of me in case you have questions during this webinar. In December of 2011, we adopted our rice cultivation project protocol, which targets methane emission reductions resulting from a change in water residue management at the rice fields. That is specifically eligible for California rice-growing regions only. We eventually do plan to expand that to more regions as well, and potentially more practices than we currently include. Then we have our U.S. livestock project protocol. We also have a Mexico livestock project protocol, which I forgot to include on this slide. And there we're focusing on methane capture and destruction from anaerobic digestion of livestock manure. Finally, we've just started the scoping process to explore some new soil carbon protocols. We previously had launched a cropland management protocol development effort, which we decided to not move forward with. That would have focused on cover crops and conservation tillage. But in that process, we identified that preservation of grasslands and the conversion of marginal cropland back to grasslands was a good project type with a lot of potential. So we've actually, in the past couple of months, we had some contractors working on an issue paper for us that has been recently completed and is now available on our website, talking about the potential for a grasslands protocol and kind of all the things that the reserve will need to be considering as we begin that process. And then we also have been internally scoping out potential project types regarding the restoration of peat soils. All of these would be crediting the soil carbon in those projects. And we have some scoping meetings that we're planning for the end of February, early March. I'll talk about those a little bit more in a moment, but basically we haven't set the dates yet. Those dates will be going out next week. Next slide. There we go. Sorry, technical difficulties over here. All right, so the nitrogen management protocol. Basically, to give you a little bit of background on nitrous oxide and why we chose the project type that we did for one of our first and hopefully most comprehensive agricultural protocols. Nitrous oxide emissions from U.S. agricultural lands amount to 205 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year. That's about 70% of total U.S. nitrous oxide emissions and 3% of total U.S. GHG emissions. That number has risen by 3.5% since 1990. And specifically focusing within nitrous oxide, we knew that we needed to, we really wanted to do a nitrogen management protocol to address this really large emission source. And doing research, we realized that corn is by far the most intensive user of fertilizer in the U.S., both on a per acre and total use basis. And fertilizer applied to corn is the least likely to be applied in accordance with best management practices. I'll talk about the suite of best management practices that we're considering there in a moment, but primarily in this protocol we're looking at your N rate, the N application rate, so the total amount of N you're applying in a year, and corn is also the least likely to be applied within proper amounts of N application rates. A little bit more background there. As we get into the protocol, you'll see it's regionally specific at this time to what we call the North Central region. 80% of corn for grain is grown in that region. So we thought that, and other organizations, MSU, EFRI, who I believe are on the line, Michigan State University, and the Electric Power Research Institute, both of those organizations have really been instrumental in helping us to get this methodology adopted, including for that North Central region focus, and we'll talk a little bit more about why they focus there in a moment. But the fact that so much corn is grown in the Corn Belt, which is what mostly comprises the North Central region, is a big factor as well. So with regards to our nitrogen management protocol development goals, I'm not going to talk about that much of the development process unless we have questions on it today. But basically, our goal is to develop a standardized approach for quantifying, monitoring, and verifying the greenhouse gas reductions resulting from changes in nitrogen management practices on U.S. croplands. So targeting nitrous oxide emissions, and we initially wanted it to be as broadly applicable as possible. So as many crops and as many regions within the U.S. as we possibly could, but at the same time we wanted to maintain this high level of accuracy. And so I'll talk in a little bit in a moment about how data limitations in terms of where the science is today in terms of nitrous oxide emissions from croplands, how that's limited our protocol to date. We also wanted to maintain consistency with and build upon, improve upon existing methodologies. Like I mentioned, the nitrogen management, the quantification methodology for this protocol we really build off of the MSU EPRI methodology, which has been adopted by both BCS and ACR. We have a little bit of a different process. For developing our protocols, we really have a multi-stakeholder process, and so though the MSU EPRI protocol was a complete methodology once we first were able to review it, we do take that methodology and others that we are considering to our stakeholder work group and kind of pick and choose which aspects we want to include in our protocol. And in this case, quite a few of the other portions of the protocol are a bit different, but the quantification itself for the most important emission sources are very, very close to what MSU EPRI's methodology has done. Finally, of course, we want to ensure accuracy and practicality of projects, so really focusing on cost-effective measurements and monitoring and verification techniques. So the project definition, at this point, we've designed the protocol so that though it is relatively limited in scope initially with version 1.1, it will be easy to expand it. So the project definition is meant to be all-encompassing. From the protocol, it says the project is the adoption and maintenance of an approved project activity that reduces nitrous oxide emissions. Like I said, approved project activities have been limited due to lack of data. As of now, in version 1.1 and in version 1.0 as well, the only approved project activity is a reduction in the annual nitrogen fertilizer application rate. And that's compared to your historic application rates at the site without going below the end demand. Without going below the end demand is something that we felt was important to include because we wanted to make sure that reducing nitrogen application rates wasn't having an impact on the total corn being produced at any one project site. So that was something that our Science Advisory Committee, which, this is the first protocol we've convened, a Science Advisory Committee, and that was because we thought the science we were so on the leading edge of what was going on in the scientific community that we really wanted to have scientists at the table helping us to work through all these issues. They really thought it was important to say that we didn't want to be encouraging farmers to reduce their N rate by so much that they would affect their yield and effectively their bottom line in a negative way. Like I said, at this point, the protocol is only applicable to corn systems in the north-central region of the U.S. That's roughly the Corn Belt plus a few states. I'll show you a map of that region momentarily. One departure of our protocol with the MSU EPRI protocol is that we only credit in this protocol reductions in synthetic nitrogen. So farmers typically many farmers are also applying organic N, so any sort of manure or compost, those types of sources. Those are allowable in the protocol, and you are allowed to reduce them if you would like to as a project developer, but those reductions aren't credited, and we do have a way of making sure that we aren't actually crediting you for those reductions. And the reason for that was that our Science Advisory Committee, or many members of our Science Advisory Committee and our work group were concerned that we didn't think there was enough data at this time to be quantifying that organic N reduction. So we wanted to wait a little bit more on that until we had a larger set of data points to look at that curve. We do think it's probably going to be roughly the same as for synthetic N from what we've seen, but we do plan on continuing to evaluate that issue. Finally, like I said, future versions of the protocol will include additional regions, crops, and project activities once data is available. Right now in our protocol in Appendix D, we provide some loose guidelines on the types and quality of data needed for future protocol expansions. We refer to that as our minimum data standard. To date, we haven't created any sort of process where the public can submit data or recommendations for data and studies that have been done to us. But in the coming months, we're looking at trying to make that more of a clear, transparent process that we can set up that people really know so that the research community really knows what types of things we require to be able to develop further emission factors, and even what they would need to do to develop an emission factor that we might eventually include in the protocol. So, and in terms of data limitations, we add data limitations both in the science, so with regards to there not being enough studies that actually are measuring nitrous oxide emissions from the fields and from each of the individual practices on the fields. But also, like I mentioned, we really put a high priority on standardizing as much as possible within this protocol. And the test for additionality, our performance standard, which I'll talk about more in a moment, that really needs to be standardized as well. And so we look at kind of what are the trends of adoption in the industry of various practices so that we can try and figure out what is common practice and what would be an additional action beyond that. And so with regards to these practices, we were really limited in terms of data, where data was available on some of them. The Corn Belt, again, was a place where there was a lot of data available, and so that made it easier to set the performance standards. So as more data becomes available in both those areas, we can continue to move forward with the protocol. And one more thing about that, our priorities include for that protocol trying to make the protocol applicable to California, both reducing N and other practices, as well as, like I said, expanding the geographic and crop coverage for reduction in N applied. So right now, it's only applicable to corn. It's a little bit complicated in terms of accounting. If you have a rotation that's corn and soy or corn and wheat, it is still permissible, but we would like to eventually have it so that you can be credited for all years and have, you know, potentially there's probably not going to be much credits available for soy years because soy is an N-fixing crop, but for wheat there definitely is some potential there. So we would like to try and make that a more complete process. All right, sorry about that. Next slide. So like I said, the only creditable project activity right now is a reduction in N applied, and that's really how the quantification methodology quantifies these emission reductions. We use an emission factor, which I'll talk about more momentarily, that really focuses on the volume of N you're reducing. However, the protocol, as well as MSU EPRI's versions of the protocol, really encourages implementation of additional nitrogen best management practices. This is because basically these BMPs really help to increase a crop's nitrogen use efficiency. So for each unit of fertilizer you're applying, the crop is able to take up more of it more efficiently. These BMPs can also really enable, by increasing the nitrogen use efficiency, they're enabling the maximum N rate reduction possible without going below N demand. So by increasing the efficiency, you can use less to have the same, meet the same demand. Finally, and these are all kind of interrelated, you can really help maintain, or even there are some studies that show you can increase crop yields by implementing this full suite of best management practices. So there's, in the industry, the fertilizer industry really refers to the 4 R's for nitrogen BMPs. Those are the right rate, the right time, right placement, and right type. So for example, if you were originally applying your fertilizer in the fall and you now want to apply it in the spring, that will enable you, in theory, to reduce your N rate further than you might have otherwise been able to reduce your N rate just on its own. And so placement, again, where you're placing the fertilizer is important, as well as the type of fertilizer you're applying. Timing also can include multiple applications, so you can apply it in the spring and then maybe again closer to when the crop might demand more nitrogen, etc. So by including all of these BMPs, really encouraging them, we really think of them as enabling practices that allow for the project developer to really focus on maximizing that N rate reduction of ultimately your emission reductions. Like I said, eventually the protocol will hopefully include a more complete suite of practices. So you might receive additional credit for those changes beyond what is just the N rate reduced, because they are having an impact on nitrous oxide emissions beyond just the reduction in N rate, the volume. But for now, we're focusing on crediting just the N rate reductions. So this is a map of the North Central region. All of the states here, regardless of colors, include the North Central region. Those 12 states are Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, North Dakota, Ohio, South Dakota, and Wisconsin. Wow, testing my abbreviations of all the states there. But within those states, we actually, as part of our public comment period, so the protocol is all as part of our, really making sure that this is an open public process and including all of the stakeholders we possibly can, we do put our protocols out for a public comment period before it goes to our board, and we respond to all the comments that we receive and try and really take into consideration their concerns. And one of our comments that we received had been concerned that the entire NCR, as we call the North Central region, the entire NCR might be too far to extrapolate data which had come from Michigan in the MSU EPRI study. So we did a little bit of DNDC analysis looking at things like precipitation, soil type, other weather, temperature, etc., and tried to figure out within what range we really felt comfortable extrapolating. And so the green area that you see on your screen is the range of 600 to 1,200 millimeters of precipitation a year. That's the mean annual over 100 years. And so basically we decided to restrict eligibility to those counties that are shaded green there. And really what's mostly being excluded is the far western regions of the Plain States, which I think many people will agree are much more arid and do have a different ecosystem. So it may be that eventually we're able to get some data for Kansas or Nebraska or the Dakotas that we then can validate this this emission factor for that area and maybe take a larger uncertainty deduction. But for now, we felt comfortable reducing it slightly and then including the rest of the states that are included here. We also, in doing that, decided to, there is an uncertainty deduction that you take kind of at the end of the quantification process. And for all projects located in Michigan, which is where the data for this emission factor originally came from, all the states in Michigan have a much smaller uncertainty, or all the projects in Michigan have a much smaller uncertainty deduction than the rest of the green areas in the NCR, and that's because we didn't have as much validation data as we would have liked. So at a later time, we hope to be able to reduce that uncertainty as we continue to get more data for those additional states. Next slide. So project aggregation. Basically, to make agricultural projects most cost effective, we decided to begin really thinking about project aggregation with both our rice and nitrogen management projects or project protocols. And so a project aggregate is defined in this protocol as any project comprised of 2 or more fields which can be located on 1 or more farm operations. So you don't need to do much to have an aggregate, you just need more than 1 field. But once you have an aggregate, it becomes a lot easier to scale up the emission reductions because some of the reporting requirements do become reduced. For example, if one farmer has 10 fields enrolled, they have to put together monitoring plans for their fields, but they can develop the same monitoring plan that talks about each of the different fields, so there's less redundancy and some cost savings there. Aggregation is optional, but we think it's likely to be the most common type of project we see under this protocol. Like I said, it really boosts cost effectiveness because of many transaction costs, but most directly it eases verification costs. Verification can be the biggest cost a project has to undertake, and we have rules around aggregation, which I'll talk about towards the end of the presentation, that allows for reduced verification requirements. Not every single field needs to be site visited every single year to have the whole aggregate verified. So there are some cost savings there. Credits are issued to the aggregator for distribution, and that's just because the aggregator is ultimately the person that or entity that the reserve is interacting with directly. So every project participant in the aggregate should be receiving the credits that they kind of contributed to the whole aggregate, but it is distributed to the aggregator for distribution. Growers can choose to act as their own aggregator. So one farmer may say, I have 10 fields that I want to be in an aggregate. It's just me. I don't want any of my friends. I'm going to do this all myself. Or they can say to their neighbor, hey, I'm doing this project. Why don't you join me as well? However, aggregators can also be kind of the typical project developers we see in the carbon offset sphere. Some of these companies you hear about all the time, and they may be able to bring their expertise in kind of developing carbon projects to the table, partner with some local agricultural organizations, and really be able to scale this up as well. So the protocol is flexible. So eligibility rules, which I'll get into momentarily, particularly start date and crediting periods, are all associated with and evaluated at the individual field level. So not the aggregate level. So for example, an aggregate, once it's up and running, it could run for 20, 30 years. But the crediting period for each individual field to be able to receive credits is more limited. We thought that was helpful in terms of really kind of, again, reducing transaction costs and really allowing for aggregators to keep including more projects in more fields within the same project and really being able to maximize the economies of scale there. Finally, with regards to aggregation throughout the protocol, we really have clear and consistent requirements for all things related to the aggregate as opposed to a single field project. So there are rules governing how, when you can enter and leave an aggregate, though there are limited opportunities for fields to switch between aggregates in a given crediting period. We have rules for monitoring and reporting for the aggregate as well as what's happening on the field level, and then of course for verification practices. So eligibility rules. Section 3 of the protocol really gets into all of the eligibility. Like I said, the north central region of the U.S. Is the location that the projects are eligible. Again, there's that additional restriction which we include in section 5.1, which is the quantification section of the protocol, the additional precipitation limitation. A project start date is the first date of a new cultivation cycle on which the project activity is implemented. So that's actually the day after you complete the harvest the previous year. So even though you might not be applying your fertilizer until the spring, you're technically starting as a project developer, you're starting the project the day after your previous year's harvest is over. Right now, we're not doing any sort of crediting with regards to crop residue management in this protocol, but we wanted to define a cultivation cycle consistently through our protocols, and this is how we do it in rice, where we do look at the crop residue management. So we're trying to be consistent. For the first 12 months after protocol adoption, so until June of this year, fields with a start date on or after June 27, 2010 are eligible. Additionality, you have to meet the performance standard, which is to exceed the RTA threshold. I'll explain what that means momentarily. You also have to exceed any legal requirements throughout the project area. So that's the region in which the project is located. That's the federal, state, or local level. Finally, we do have some restrictions with regards to eligibility if you are receiving NRCS EQIP payments specifically for N rate reductions. It's a little bit complicated. I'm not planning to go into that in depth unless there are questions on it. But basically, we combine the start date policy with when you're receiving the ecosystem services payments to consider whether or not your project will be eligible. So basically, if you have already been receiving EQIP payments for CPS 590, which is the nutrient management practice standard, then and you're currently receiving those payments you were before the project, you're not eligible. But if you simultaneously pursue these payments as well as starting a project, the idea is that you're allowed to stack because you needed both revenues, the carbon revenue and the ecosystem services revenue, to get a project off the ground. But if you do receive those payments and in an eligible project, you have to reduce the amount of credits you receive based on the portion of public dollars you're receiving. Like all of our protocols, the projects need to be in compliance with all applicable laws. The crediting period for these protocols are 5 eligible crop years. A crop year is a corn year, or an eligible crop year is a year of corn being grown. So if you are growing continuous corn crops, then you could have a five-year project that takes place over 5 years. However, we wanted some additional flexibility for crop rotations, and so if you have a corn crop in rotation with a wheat crop, you're allowed to stretch out your crediting period for up to 10 years, only getting credit for the corn crops you're growing, but you do have to report some minimal things to us in the off years. You don't have to verify, but you do have to continue reporting, just so that we know that you're not loading up nitrogen in that off year, that you're not growing corn to skew your end rate reductions at a later time. And the crediting period is renewed one time. So the total years of crediting you can get is 10. Finally, there's a number of other criteria we have in this protocol. Lands that have no previous cropping history are ineligible. We don't want you breaking new ground specifically so that you can get carbon revenues. Lands that are designated as highly erodible lands and or wetlands, and that's, there's specific guidance in the protocol about kind of how you determine that, and it coincides with the U.S. government's definition of those things. If you have a project located on either of those two types of lands, you must be implementing the highly erodible land conservation or wetlands conservation provisions to be eligible. Those are, again, rules that the U.S. government set up in Farm Bill 30 years ago, and they're still in place today. Basically, we want to make sure that you're conserving that land appropriately if you're going to be doing a project. This is a change from version 1.0 of the protocol. We initially had excluded those entirely, but that was actually in error, and we decided to broaden that, fix that in this update of the protocol and broaden that back up. So if you're doing what you need to get any other sort of farm payments from the U.S. government, then you'll be eligible. So these are the things you need to do to get any sort of monies from NRCS or FSA or any of the programs under USDA. Finally, and this is really for quantification purposes, management and verification purposes, management records from at least the past 5 years, or in the case of a crop rotation, the past 3 years of the corn crop need to be available so that you can set your baseline looking at your historic management practices. And finally, you can't increase the frequency of your corn crop being grown due to the project. So if you were previously in an every other year crop rotation for corn, let's say corn wheat, you can't all of a sudden change to doing continuous corn. Basically, we look at that as something that's, though you might be reducing your emissions and while simultaneously doing that, we weren't comfortable because of the fact that it might be encouraging basically, again, lands that hadn't been in production or maybe had a more holistic management approach. We don't want to move towards continuous corn because, in our view, that could potentially raise the issue of doing environmental harm. And our protocols, we always strive to not do any sort of negative to the environment. Like I said, there's a few more applicability criteria in section 5.1, which I go into right now. And these are specific to the methodology, the MSU EPRI methodology. So again, this is our protocol is designed to be easily expanded. So this applicability criteria is specific to the quantification methodology we have currently. And again, so we have no organic soils and or histosols. That's because the emission factor was developed not on those soils, and they can be very different nitrous oxide behaviors. Like I said, we limit the precipitation of the county where the project is located. Corn cropping systems, which are regularly irrigated, are not eligible, though we do allow for emergency irrigation in years of severe drought. So that's when the USDA Secretariat designates a county a disaster because of the drought. And that, again, is because the methodology was not developed with irrigated crops in mind, and the nitrous oxide behaviors are different. In version 1.1 of the protocol, tile drained fields are eligible as long as tile drained fields were, as long as the field was underlain with tile drains in the baseline as well. So if you put in tile drains specifically for the project, you're ineligible. But if you've had tile drains all along, then you are eligible. Like I said, this is a change in version 1.1 of the protocol. Finally, like I said, with regards to synthetic and organic fertilizer, we're only crediting the reductions in synthetic N rate. However, you may apply both synthetic and organic fertilizer. You may even choose to reduce your organic fertilizer or increase your organic fertilizer as you like. But at the end of the day, the total N rate has to go down, as well as the synthetic N rate going down to be eligible and to receive any credits, just the way the math works. Next slide. So, Scott, do we have a hand being raised? Is that a question someone has? Maybe we can check.
I think it's just up from the beginning.
All right. So the performance standard, basically, projects have to pass. Every field must pass the performance standard every year, and every field. If certain fields in the project don't pass the performance standard, those fields are simply left out by the aggregator when you actually bring it to verification. And there's other rules regarding that. But basically, the performance standard is the removed to applied ratio. And we basically, the removed to applied ratio, or RTA, is a nitrogen use efficiency metric. Basically, it's something we developed, but nitrogen use efficiency is something that is relatively common to think about in the industry. Basically, you multiply your yield, your historic yield, by the nitrogen content of the crop, which is a default we provide, divided by your total N rate. And you get this ratio, which is essentially the ratio of N removed by the crop to N applied as fertilizer. So that, presumably is leaving you what is the N that is lost by the lost as nitrous oxide or as leaching, etc. Like I said, fields must pass the performance standard each year. In the first 2 years of a project, or specifically for implementing a project on a given field, that field has a 2-year grace period where they're allowed to slowly reduce their N rate. So if you can't quite reach the RTA threshold, which is set at the state average RTA, if you can't quite reach that RTA threshold, but you are making an N rate reduction and you are able to quantify nitrous oxide reductions, you are still eligible as long as in the 3rd year of implementing the project activity you do get below that, well, I guess it's the ratio, the higher you are, the better you are, so you actually have to be above the ratio in terms of nitrogen efficiency, but in terms of thinking what your N rate level is, you have to get below it, if that makes sense. So you have those 2 years to get above the N rate threshold. Growers can determine their eligibility before the project ex ante using those historic yields to back calculate a minimum N rate reduction that will get them to their performance threshold. But then they do actually pass the performance standard at the end when you see what the total N rate was applied. This is just a quick snapshot of the table we have in the Appendix A of the protocol, at what those RTA thresholds look like. We included for reference what the average N rate is in each of those states, what the average yield is, and the average RTA. You'll note that corn grain and corn silage have different RTAs, as well as depending on what the crop was the previous year. So yeah, moving right along. So I'm going to keep the overview of the quantification approach relatively high level, but if there are questions, I'm happy to dive in. Like I said, the primary effects quantified with in this protocol are quantified with an emission factor approach, which is based on the Hoban et al. Study, which has been used in the MSU EPRI methodology. Basically, it's a regional for the North Central region, nonlinear emission factor for direct N2O emissions. When I say nonlinear, that means as the total N applied to the field increases, the actual amount of nitrous oxide emitted increases as well. This was something that was relatively groundbreaking for the Hoban et al. Study to put forth. The IPCC methodology for the direct N2O emissions actually has a linear emission factor, but we've realized that in the corn, in corn and in the NCR where it is being applied at such high rates, it is nonlinear. So, so we use that emission factor here. The direct N2O emissions methodology is almost identical to, or I think it is identical with the exception of our uncertainty methodology is identical to the MSU EPRI methodology. Then the other primary, what we consider the primary emissions in this protocol are the leaching, runoff, and volatilization emissions. In the IPCC terminology, this is referred to as indirect N2O emissions. And that is both IPCC and just the scientific community at large. We decided that because in carbon offsets, indirect can refer to something else, indirect emissions can refer to something that is beyond the control of the project developer, we've decided that we wanted to change that terminology. So in this protocol, we refer to those as the LVRO emissions. The MSU EPRI methodology adapted the IPCC methodology a little bit. They don't include consideration of crop residue here, and we also use their adaptations. We also don't include a crop residue input to this equation. We do have a slight difference in terms of how we calculate the fraction of N that is leaching off the field. I'm happy to answer questions on that, but again, that's pretty in the weeds. So I'm going to skip that unless people have specific questions. Finally, the secondary emissions that are being quantified in this protocol are actually were developed by the reserve processes ourselves. There's really only two primary sources that need to be quantified here, and they're only quantified if there's evidence that the project has resulted in an increase in emissions in either of these sources. So one is that, say you have increased the number of applications there are in a given year. So instead of applying your fertilizer once in the spring, you apply it 6 different times in small amounts. You're going to be increasing your emissions from cultivation equipment by needing to pass over the field multiple times. So in that case, you do have to quantify that increase in emissions from cultivation equipment. However, if you don't change the number of passes you're going over the field, there's no evidence you've changed your management practices with regards to the cultivation equipment, then you don't have to quantify that. And then also, like I mentioned, our scientific advisory committee felt it was important to maintain yields that we wouldn't go below the crop demand when we reduce the N rate. So basically, if you reduce your yield, and that's there's a process by which we look at kind of how the county has performed. If the county is all having a lower, if all fields in the county are having a lower yield that year because of weather impacts, then we'll take that into consideration. But compared to the normalized county average, we look at whether or not there's been a yield impact, and if so, you have to take a deduction for the increased emissions from presumably shifting crop production, not implementing good N application practices to elsewhere. So I've included an example which I feel like is more helpful than actually going through in more detail the quantification of all the different equations. So basically in our example here, I picked miscellaneous county, Bond County in Illinois. The grower in this example is growing continuous corn for grain, and he wants to evaluate the potential emission reductions for a project. So I put here some information both about the scenario at the project site as well as what's the average in Illinois. So looking at historic yields, and I'm assuming this is an average, which will then go into all of these historic yields are kind of the average yield over the past, average yield, average N rate, et cetera, over the past 5 years, which ends up being used to set the baseline. I've called them historic here for clarity. But basically, prior to the project, on average, this farmer was getting 170 bushels per acre. You'll notice that's a little bit below the Illinois average, but he was actually applying much more N than is average in Illinois. So he was applying 230 pounds of N per acre, and the average in Illinois is 157 pounds per acre. For the purposes of calculation of this example, I had to break it out in terms of how much synthetic and organic he was applying. I'm assuming 180 pounds per acre of synthetic and 50 per acre of organic. I'm assuming that the grower is not going to change their organic N in the baseline, between the baseline and project, basically because they're not getting any credit for that and for simplicity. So just assume that remains constant. So I calculated the historic RTA as well as show the Illinois average there. You can see that he is below the threshold at this point. So right now, he is not yet eligible. But of course, that's based on his historic practices. He hasn't yet attempted to reduce his N rate to meet that threshold. So he, my example farmer does a back calculation, like I said, before he even decides to do the project, and he sees that if he can reduce his fertilizer to 198, then he can meet the threshold. He'll get that 0.68 RTA. So that's his minimum. That's his maximum project N rate. So the minimum project reduction to meet the RTA threshold. He decides to, go it a little further just in case, and he decides to use a project N rate of 190 pounds per acre. So that works out to 150 pounds per acre of synthetic. No, I'm sorry, 140 pounds per acre of synthetic and another 50 pounds per acre of organic. I calculated the baseline and project emissions for you, and this grower is estimated to get 1.6 tons of carbon equivalent reduction per acre. So it's 1.6 credits in our system. So over, a 1,000-acre farm, that can be a substantial carbon offset revenue. So as this farmer, I'm sorry, I'm missing some of my slide notes here. Odd. Okay, sorry about that. Here we are. Okay. So monitoring and reporting requirements. Like I said, there's some streamlining that happens there. We've designed the monitoring and reporting to be specific to a scenario when you are an aggregate versus the scenario when the project is a single field project. There's less total reports and monitoring plans to put together for a single field project, but they do include all of the requirements that are in both the aggregate and the field level monitoring plans within the aggregate. So they're more comparable to kind of all of the things that are required in the aggregate situation. The aggregate has a monitoring plan for the aggregate level, and that really talks about kind of information management and such. The report is relatively high level that they submit, and that is made public, the aggregate level report as well as the single field report. However, for each field in the aggregate, those monitoring plans and reports are kept private. So they're made available to the aggregator for emissions reductions calculations. They're made available to the verifier for verification purposes. And if need be, they're made available to the reserve if we decide we need to do oversight on the project. But in this way, we're able to kind of take into account the sensitivity of farmers sharing confidential information while maintaining the need for rigor in terms of monitoring. And also, buyers of carbon offset credits really like to be able to see everything that's going on in the project, and we think we hit the right balance of what needs to be included at the aggregate level and made public versus what is not. Finally, one requirement we have that's across the board, and this is in addition to monitoring things like how much N are you applying and what is your yield, et cetera, we introduced a monitoring requirement of a cornstalk nitrate test to all fields. This is low cost. It's about $15 to do, and basically we allow it for on one CSNT test for up to 100 acres within the project. If you have more than 100 acres per field, you have to do more than one test. But basically, the idea is to help us identify where a farmer might say that they had a much bigger reduction than we think they actually had. So we're trying to weed out where there might be more risk of a reduction that is being claimed might not actually occur. And this is because one of the main ways that we're reporting and even verifying these activities is that we're looking at farmer records. And so because that's something that's kept by someone who's so directly involved in the project, and there's not like an external monitoring program that can happen like the way we would in a methane project with livestock where we have a flow meter, there's nothing like that. So the farmer records become very important. And so this cornstalk nitrate test is just one additional external thing that can inform verification. If you, in your cornstalk nitrate test, it shows that you have excessive uses of nitrogen, it doesn't mean that you didn't make a reduction. It might mean that you had a very, very large N application rate previously and you've reduced, but it's still pretty excessive. That means that you can reduce further, and that can help you figure out what is the maximum N rate you can have, N rate reduction you can have while maintaining the N demand of the crop. So it can inform the project developer in terms of adaptive management as well. Finally, verification. Verification is required annually for aggregates. In theory, it's required annually for single-field projects as well, but we do have some flexibility mechanisms in the protocol where you can choose to do a 24-month verification period, or you can do a 12-month verification period with a site visit followed by a desk review the following year. So we do have some mechanisms there, but to be issued credits, you need to every year you would need to be verified every year. However, verification of aggregates occurs through random sampling of the fields within the aggregate. So not every field will receive a site visit or maybe even a desk audit in any given year. It depends on the size of the aggregates. And if it's the aggregate that's smaller than 10 fields, we consider it a small aggregate, and we have rules for that. If it's a large multi-participant aggregate, which is when there are 20 fields or more, site visits are limited to up to 15% of the total eligible fields in any given year. So we really are trying to bring about the verification cost savings by allowing this to be scaled. And basically, the idea is that the random sampling, a field really doesn't know if they're going to be selected in any given year, and there are penalties for if you get selected for a verification site visit and it's shown that you didn't do as a project developer what you said you did in that year, then there's penalties for that. Other fields also have to be additional fields beyond the 15% may need to be visited depending on the type of kind of errors in quantification, or if it was the project participant was not being truthful, et cetera. Depending on the reasons, there might be additional requirements for verification. But basically, the idea is that we're trying to scale these projects, recognizing that to really have a lot of carbon offsets from agriculture, we need to have some pretty big projects. Finally, throughout the protocol, we provide extensive guidance on kind of preparing for verification, both as a project developer and as the verifier. And really, we provide guidance on how the reduction in N rates, which you're relying for the most part on farm management records and sales receipts, things like that, how you can verify that that occurred through the triangulation of data. Sorry, that slide should have the word verification in the final bullet point. But so basically, using multiple data sources, looking at them all together, kind of at what point is there enough risk to add additional site visits beyond the preliminary requirement.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Teresa. That was really good. I think I learned more about nitrogen in this hour than I did my whole life. So thanks a lot for that. So like I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, I'm going to try to open up the audio for participants that want to ask any questions. And if you would like to ask a question, just raise your hand, and I will open up your audio, and we can go from there.
In the meantime, do you want to show that other slide the next slide while we're waiting for some people to ask questions?
Sure.
We can give our contact information as well.
Sure. We do have a couple of events coming up. some workshops. We're planning to be down in Kissimmee, Florida in late February at the Commodity Classic. So if you'll be in attendance, be sure to come by and check out our booth. I will be at the AgStar conference promoting our livestock protocol. And as always, we do have our annual conference in San Francisco coming up in April.
And then, like I mentioned earlier, we do have these upcoming scoping meetings for the soil carbon protocols, both grasslands and peatlands. We will be holding 2 meetings. It's looking like the last week of February, first week or 2 of March. Dates and locations will be announced officially next week, but we are hoping to have one California meeting, most likely in the Sacramento or Davis area, and then one meeting in the Midwest. We're thinking right now it's going to be Minneapolis, so you can start thinking about which meeting you'd rather attend if you're excited about that, but we will be announcing that next week. And if you're not already on the Climate Action Reserve mailing list, please make sure you do that. You can sign up on our website, and then you will hear about these scoping meetings. So, are there any questions?
Okay. I don't see any hands coming up, but we'll give it another minute or 2, and if there are no questions, you could always send them to us via email, and always you can go to our website. But if not, oh, I see a question coming in. Looks like it's being typed in. Oh, false alarm. All right. Well, if there's no questions, then I'll go ahead and move to let me see. It looks like we have a question from Joanne. I've unmuted your line, Joanne, if you would like to ask your question.
Well, that's focus. No, I was just wondering if we could get the meeting material.
In this meeting?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. We will be making these slides available on our website. We've also recorded this webinar, and we will be posting it on our website as well. So that will probably go up sometime tonight. Our web person typically works at night. So check back tomorrow morning, and you'll be able to get that, download those materials.
Okay, so the audio didn't sound like it was coming through, but we do have some other questions that have come through just typed in through the webinar software. So I'll go ahead and jump to those. From Matthew, when do you anticipate other crops or other regions will be added to the nitrogen management protocol?
Like I said, we hope to include more as soon as possible, as soon as data is available. We are continuing to evaluate on an ongoing basis data sources, data sets, articles that are submitted to us. Like I said, we think that developing a process that is a little bit more predefined and clear for stakeholders will be helpful towards making that happen. You know, we typically wait until someone else has developed a methodology for something, and then we build upon it. So in the case of the MSU EPRI methodology, they had taken the study, the Hoban et al. Study, and some of the authors of the Hoban et al. Study were those who developed the MSU EPRI methodology, Neville Miller and Phil Robertson, and basically they kind of put together the emission factor for us. It wasn't as much work. Whereas looking at some of the data sets out there now, we need to do more work. So we're hoping that we can get some of the research community to really do the legwork with regards to coming up with those emission factors. So, you know, I know that there's a data set out of Colorado that we believe may be applicable to more of the kind of arid region, the western arid and even the plains regions that we're exploring, and that would also be for corn, but potentially with more project activities included. We're also looking at some data that's coming out of California. So we are actively looking at these data sets as they become available, and I encourage you, if you do see something or want me to consider some sort of study, please do send those along to me at my email address, which is on your screen right now. But in terms of a specific timeline, we just don't have one yet. It really depends on kind of when we get these additional data sources. So please be encouraged that we'll consider them once we get them.
Great, thanks. And another question coming in from Dennis, and then if we don't get any other questions, we'll try to wind it down. From Dennis, so how do you determine the value of the offset? So that's an interesting question. There has been some speculation or some discussion amongst the Air Resources Board that this is a protocol that they're interested in adopting. So if that's the case, there is a significant price premium on credits that can be converted into compliance offsets and be used under the state's cap and trade program. So if that were to be the case, then you'd see pricing, go up. I think right now compliance eligible offsets are trading around, $8, kind of in that range. On the voluntary side, I think it tends to be, just $1 or $2 generally, depending on the project and the buyer. In the voluntary market, prices can range, but they are significantly lower than compliance offsets.
That said, though, to be clear, the reserve itself doesn't do any sort of work on establishing the value itself of the offsets. The offsets are bought and sold in the free market, and so it's basically kind of where supply meets demand. That being said, we do really strive to make sure that our offsets have very high integrity, so that the offsets we are crediting and that are on our reserve registry, that they are truly the highest quality offsets. And we think that this protocol really has made sure that that is the case. Also, just to touch very briefly on what Scott was mentioning with regards to the state of California, because I'm sure everyone on the phone is interested in that as well. They've said numerous times that they would really like to include agricultural protocols in the compliance protocols that are eligible under the California cap and trade system. They are going to be looking at a rice cultivation protocol, both our protocol as well as the others that are available out there, to begin developing their own rice protocol in the coming year. They're hoping to have that protocol complete and brought to their board by fall of 2013. But it's a longer timeline on which they're considering the nitrogen management protocol. They realize that especially for California, because there's so many crops here, the research that has been done in California is kind of dispersed across a number of different crops, and so they didn't have enough data. At least when we set out to do this process, there may be more studies available now. I think there are more studies available now. But they realize that they need to do more work and have more research done, and ARB is actually funding research, primary research on nitrous oxide emissions from crops. So they hope to convene a stakeholder work group process in 2014, but the exact kind of timing of that, it remains to be seen. That said, I have spoken to ARB a little bit and heard from them about kind of how exactly it will work in terms of early action projects. So previously, the ARB adopted the reserve's fully fledged protocols as they were. So there were credits in existence and projects in existence that had been developed to those standards. So when they adopted them, it was a very easy transition because for the most part, if you had been following the protocol of the reserves, you would then be able to meet all of the requirements of the in theory, the compliance protocol. However, like I said, with rice, they've decided to develop their own protocol. So the way that the reserve has, they will build off of the protocols that have already been developed, definitely taking into consideration that there will be projects in the system by the time they have an ARB protocol. And recognizing that, they said that as long as projects are maintaining, meeting the requirements that are in the ARB protocol, that they will still be eligible. So it might be that the quantification was a little bit different, or like the actual total number of credits might be different. So you might not be able to convert it directly, and I have no idea how that process itself will work. But they did say that for projects that are meeting the main requirements of the protocol, and I think that's mostly with regards to eligibility and project activity and things like that, then they will really try and make an effort to allow those projects to transition over. So I know that there's been some hesitancy of some of the growers I've talked to, not knowing what the ultimate ARB version of the protocol will look like, but I think that if you really are keeping good records, and this protocol does encourage you to keep good records on all of your management practices in case those are able to be credited eventually, we think that we've developed enough of a rigorous protocol that you will be able to meet those additional requirements with ARB ultimately. So, but like I said, it'll be a little while until we know what that protocol looks like exactly.
Yeah, kind of getting into the crystal ball territory a little bit, but it's something to kind of look forward to and plan for and keep on your radar. So with that, we will go ahead and close out the webinar. Thanks a lot for everyone who dialed in and participated, and have a good day.